Full court press. The Trump administration springs into action to find a replacement for Justice Anthony Kennedy. We're at the White House. Divided Congress. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill weigh in on possible Supreme Court candidates and when senators may hold confirmation hearings. The future of the church. Pope Francis installs 14 new cardinals from 11 countries. We're at the Vatican. And an honor in Times Square. Cardinal Timothy Dolan visits the statue of a Catholic priest who was a highly decorated Army chaplain. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, June 28, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Former Vice President Joe Biden is urging Americans to demand President Donald Trump nominate a, quote, consensus candidate to the Supreme Court. But Democrats and Republicans seem even more divided on a possible replacement for Justice Anthony Kennedy, who announced he's retiring from the High Court. White House correspondent Mark Irons joins us with the latest as President Trump considers who he's going to nominate. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Many Catholics and evangelical Christians voted for President Trump because he promised to elect conservative, pro-life judges. He nominated current Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, and now he has the opportunity to add another justice who values the rights of the unborn.
We have a pick to come up. We have to pick a great one.
Who will it be? The president says he'll choose from a list of 25 candidates the White House began circulating late last year. It includes 24 judges from across the nation and Utah's Republican Senator Mike Lee. The nominee could change the decision-making landscape at the High Court for decades to come.
We have to pick one that's going to be there for 40 years, 45 years. We need intellect. We need so many things.
The president has committed to selecting pro-life justices, and he says fighting for life is a priority.
Under my administration, we will always defend the very first right in the Declaration of Independence, and that is the right to life.
And the potential reversal of the 1973 landmark decision to legalize abortion is already becoming a major flashpoint as President Trump considers his pick. Planned Parenthood, the nation's largest abortion provider, writes on its website, "Tell your senators now to reject any nominee who will vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, taking away our right to safe and legal abortion and endangering our health and communities." But Mallory Quigley with the national pro-life advocacy group Susan B. Anthony List blames Roe v. Wade for more than 60 million lives lost to abortion. She emphasizes the significance of this point in time for the pro-life movement.
The next person to join the Supreme Court could have the opportunity to be the swing vote on a Supreme Court case that challenges Roe versus Wade. It's very, very important and exciting that everyone stays engaged.
One of the names on the president's list of potential nominees, U.S. Court of Appeals Judge Amy Barrett. She's a Catholic mother and a former Notre Dame law professor. Her faith was called into question by Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein, who said during Barrett's hearing, quote, "The dogma lives loudly within you, and that's of concern." Wyatt?
Mark, the Senate confirms the president's nominee. Is the president concerned that Republicans could lose their slim majority there?
Well, last night the president said Kennedy's retirement makes the issue of Senate control one of the vital issues of our time. He wants to begin the process to find Justice Kennedy's replacement immediately. Don't expect him to wait until after those November midterm elections. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Even before President Trump names a replacement, Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill jockey over this key Supreme Court vacancy. Buckle up, correspondent Jason Calvi says we've got a political battle ahead. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. Yeah, one senator even says to be expecting a battle royale. Senator Chuck Schumer, the Democratic minority leader, says the Senate should reject any nominee who would overturn Roe v. Wade. And today, Democrats echo that cry.
Roe v. Wade.
Roe v. Wade.
Democrats agree. Justice Kennedy's retirement means abortion is on the line.
On issues like choice and a woman's right to make decisions about her reproductive health care, he made the right decision.
The next appointment could very well roll back the clock.
But Republican Senator Ted Cruz hopes the next appointment just follows the Constitution. He's backing his Utah colleague. Senator Mike Lee is indeed on President Trump's list of 25 possible Supreme Court nominees.
Many of the worst liberal judicial activists were put on the court by Republican presidents. So we can't mess this up. We can't roll the dice. With Mike Lee, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he will be faithful to the Constitution and Bill of Rights every single time. I think that's the single best choice the president can make.
Senator, can you tell us your reaction to Kennedy stepping down?
That looming choice whips Capitol Hill into a frenzy.
Thank you very much.
I fully expect Democrats in Congress to light their hair on fire and express great dismay.
And it will have an impact on generations to come.
But a common message.
This is a historic moment.
From Democrats.
We're at a moment.
And Republicans.
This nomination may well prove to be the single most consequential thing that President Trump does.
Whomever President Trump picks will need a simple majority here in the Senate, 51 votes. That's the exact number of Republican senators. But John McCain, Senator McCain, is at home sick. And there are 2 Republican senators who support abortion. All eyes are on them right now. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine. But 3 Democratic senators and those 2 Republicans I just mentioned did vote for Neil Gorsuch. All 3 of those Democratic senators are up for tough re-election bids in states that President Donald Trump won. Wyatt?
And what's the timeline for a confirmation vote once President Trump picks someone?
Republicans are promising a confirmation vote this fall, but Democrats say that vote needs to be postponed, that all the confirmation action needs to be postponed until after the midterm election to allow the American people to have a say on this lifetime appointment.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. From domestic issues to foreign ones, the White House confirms President Trump will hold a summit next month with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. The two will meet July 16th in Finland. They're expected to discuss national security issues, Syria, and possible election meddling. They'll also talk about how to improve relations between Washington and Moscow. The leaders have held brief meetings on the sidelines of international summits. The U.S. military joins the search for 12 boys and their soccer coach missing in Thailand for 5 days. The boys and their coach entered a cave complex on Saturday that extends for miles. It's a popular tourist destination, but floods easily during the rainy season. Officials say they believe there is enough dry ground for them to be safe. The biggest concern is if they are swept up in the swift-moving water. Nearly 500 Syrian refugees living in Lebanon are on their way back home tonight, and they're not the only ones. In the coming weeks, more than 3,000 refugees are set to move back. Lebanon's government says returning to Syria is voluntary. That comes as the Syrian government, backed by allies Russia and Iran, are regaining more territory from rebels. For its part, the United Nations is cautious and warns the country is not yet safe. Prince William visits the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem on the final day of his trip to the Middle East. He was accompanied by Orthodox priests and nuns to the site of Christ's crucifixion and burial. The Duke of Cambridge also went to the Western Wall, the Jewish holy site. He is the first member of the British royal family to make an official visit to the region. Pope Francis accepts the resignations of 2 more bishops from Chile, bringing the total number so far to 5. It stems from a meeting last month where all 34 Chilean bishops offered their resignations after an ongoing sex abuse scandal there. Earlier this month, Francis accepted the departures of the bishop at the center of the investigation and 2 others. The Holy Father welcomes a delegation representing the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew I. Pope Francis says the meeting is a sign of the growth of communication between the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches. The meeting comes on the eve of tomorrow's feast of Saints Peter and Paul, an important celebration for both churches. Pope Francis elevates 14 new cardinals today in a ceremony steeped in tradition.
A che serve guadagnare il mondo intero se si è corrossi all'interno?
The Holy Father told them to resist temptations towards vanity and to stay on mission. There are now 226 cardinals. They're from 6 continents and 88 countries. With more on this, we're joined by Edward Pinton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Edward, what was the Holy Father's message to these new leaders of the Church?
Well, he gave advice as usual, Wyatt. These are his closest collaborators, his advisors, and the 14 new ones. And he wanted to really share with them, or warn them rather, not to get caught up in what he called intrigues and envy and jealousy. And instead, the antidote to that, he said, was to help the poor, the drug addicts, the imprisoned, the sick. And he said that you really shouldn't feel superior to anybody because you're a servant of Christ, and that's what really matters.
We introduced our audience to one of the new cardinals, Cardinal Sacco, last night. Give us an overview of the whole group.
Yes, well, what's significant about this group-wide is that they're mostly from the peripheries or helping the peripheries, as Pope Francis has done with a lot of the previous consistories. For example, Cardinal Pedro Barreto from Peru has done a lot in terms of environment in the Amazonian area. That's also significant for the synod next year on the Amazon. Then there's Cardinal Konrad Krajewski, who's a Polish prelate who's done a lot as the papal almoner, helping the poor here in Rome. But also there have been the usual selections. He's chosen Cardinal Angelo Becciu, who's the Sostituto, who's a very important role in the Curia, and Cardinal Luis Ladaria, who's prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. These are kind of expected appointments.
And with these new cardinals, Pope Francis is shaping the body that will elect the next pope. What do these picks say about his priorities?
Well, again, White, it's often reflective of his wish to focus on what is really the global south and where the church is growing fastest. He also chooses those who come from particularly poor areas, those with an interest in the environment, and very much it's an inclusive, it sort of gives the signal of inclusivity. Some complain about this. They say that, well, how can these cardinals have a great knowledge of the worldwide church? But others say that it is very reflective of the church today, and they think it's an important sort of gesture to make.
Very interesting to hear about all this and to hear about the ceremony today as well. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
And for more, we're joined by Dr. Matthew Bunson, an EWTN senior contributor. Okay, Matthew, let's go back a second. This ceremony, which creates new cardinals, is called a consistory. So tell us, what exactly is a consistory and what is so significant about today's consistory?
Yeah, well, the name consistory comes from the Latin for to stand together. In other words, this is a gathering of the cardinals by the Pope for a specific purpose. Today's is an ordinary public consistory, and it has its primary purpose to create new cardinals. The ceremony itself is just filled with so many of the great symbols of the cardinals. We had, for example, the placement of the red biretta, or the scarlet biretta, the cap that they wear. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the granting of a ring. And the Holy Father says to the cardinal, as he gives him his ring, he said, "Receive this ring," he says, "from Peter, and let it strengthen your faith and love for the church as it is strengthened itself by the love of the successor of the apostles." And then he also gives them a title to a church in Rome, a titular church or a deaconry, that gives them a direct connection to the pastoral care of the city that is, of course, the Pope's responsibility.
Sounds pretty incredible. Even though the Pope only created about 14 cardinals today, you see this as a very significant event. Why is it so significant?
It's significant because as of today, we have 125 electors, cardinal electors, meaning that they're under the age of 80 and therefore eligible to vote in any prospective conclave. 59 of them have been named by Pope Francis, 47 of them by Pope Benedict, and of course 19 by Pope St. John Paul II. That means that Francis has now created a majority, the largest block of voters in any conclave. It's also worth noting that Europe remains the dominant group of cardinals. There are about 53 of them, 22 of them from Italy. The rest, from 6 continents and about 65 countries, are dispersed throughout the globe. So it gives you an idea of the strength of the Italian vote in any conclave.
Edward Penton there had mentioned a few of the new cardinals. How should we get to know them a little bit better? What do they tell us about where Pope Francis is leading the church?
Yes, well, Pope Francis, we want to look at 2 in particular that he's chosen. One is Luis Ladaria, who's a prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and the other is Konrad Krajewski, who's a Polish cardinal who's in charge of the papal charities. Both are significant because they're both being made cardinals on the same day. And in a recent Reuters interview, Pope Francis talked about the fact that he looks at both as part of what he calls the long arm of the papacy. We have on the one hand the Office for Doctrine in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and then we have papal charities. As he puts it, these 2 long arms are faith and charity together. But then there was also the visit of the cardinals today to Pope Benedict XVI, right after the consistory. So Francis, again, is trying to emphasize continuity with his predecessors. And this, I think, was probably the highlight of the day for all of those cardinals in consistory.
Wow, it's pretty incredible, and to think about how a significant moment, potential significant moment, this really is for the life of the church. Dr. Matthew Bunson, an EWTN senior contributor, thanks so much.
Good to be with you.
Coming up, why a recent vote shows Republicans are still divided on immigration. And Vice President Mike Pence vows to stand with Venezuelans who have fled their country. We have analysis on his trip to Latin America and the upcoming elections in Mexico. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. The House of Representatives rejects a far-ranging immigration bill in a decisive 301 to 121 vote, with nearly half of Republicans opposing the measure.
All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Some say the vote yesterday represents the deep divide between the moderate and the conservative wings of the Republican Party. The bill was endorsed by President Trump. GOP leaders are now considering an alternative plan. First Lady Melania Trump makes a second trip to the U.S.-Mexico border. She's in Arizona, where she held a roundtable with immigration officials today. She tells them, quote, "I am here to support you and give my help on behalf of children and the families." Last week, the First Lady visited a shelter on the border in Texas. Hundreds of women march in Washington, D.C. to protest President Trump's policy on migrants. They also want to abolish Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. They're calling for an end of family detentions for migrants crossing the southern border. Vice President Mike Pence turns his focus to Ecuador today as part of his official trip to Latin America. He's working to get support in the region to pressure Venezuela's socialist government, which he says is responsible for a humanitarian crisis. Upon his arrival in Ecuador, the vice president visited a migrant facility to meet families who have fled from Venezuela.
And you're doing okay?
Pence, accompanied by his wife Karen, listened to the stories of some of the refugees. Venezuela's economy is in a deep depression, and shortages of food and medicine have forced 2 million people to leave the country. Pence is hammering Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, whose failed leadership he blamed for Venezuela's crisis.
Venezuela was once a beacon of prosperity and freedom in the New World. But under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's great democracy has been reduced by a brutal dictatorship.
Maduro recently won a second term in an election condemned as illegitimate by the U.S. and other foreign governments. It's a key issue the vice president is discussing with Ecuador's president, Lenin Moreno. Pence's visit to Ecuador comes one day after a stop in Brazil, where he visited a similar refugee camp housing Venezuelans.
We stand with you, and we will keep standing with you until democracy is restored in Venezuela.
Pence says the U.S. will give nearly $10 million to support Venezuelan migrants, a little over $1 million of which will go to Brazil. In addition to the crisis in Venezuela, the vice president is also talking with Latin American leaders about issues like commerce, security, and defense. He will meet next with the presidents of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to address the migrant crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. Joining me for a closer look at the issues is Anna Quintana, Senior Policy Analyst for Latin America and the Western Hemisphere at the Heritage Foundation. Anna, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
The vice president is talking about applying pressure to the Maduro government by trying to isolate that. Do you think other Latin American governments are going to get on board with this idea?
I mean, they've been on board, right? So since the start of the Trump administration, they've rallied the region. They really have an unprecedented amount of countries supporting the U.S. effort and supporting, other countries' efforts, like the Mexican government's efforts to diplomatically isolate the Maduro regime. So they cannot count on the legitimacy of having Latin America supporting them. They don't have that anymore.
Obviously, the concern is for the people who still live in Venezuela, are still there. Is there a concern that putting more pressure like this, economic pressure and others, could do more harm than good for the people who live under Maduro?
The economic pressure that's being applied right now are targeted sanctions against corrupt government officials in the Venezuelan government. People who have been complicit in drug trafficking, who've been complicit in destroying the country's democracy. There has not been a single sanction applied to the economy. In fact, virtually every country in Latin America has supported bringing humanitarian aid to the Venezuelan government and to the people, but the Maduro regime refuses to accept it.
Well, speaking of humanitarian aid, I had mentioned that more than $1 million of aid has been promised to Brazil to help with the influx of Venezuelans coming in there. Is it a wise move to give the Brazilian government that much money, noting that they've kind of had their own problems with corruption?
It appears that way, right? The Brazilians clearly have had their issues, but it's in Brazil's interest right now to directly support the refugees that are coming from Venezuela. I mean, they're Venezuela's land neighbor. It's a natural source for the Venezuelans who are fleeing their country, and I would imagine that amount of money, they're not going to misuse it, and they recognize that Venezuela is a priority for the Trump administration, and they're going to continue collaborating with the United States on it.
Yeah, they know they're watching.
Exactly.
I want to turn this week, switch gears a little bit to the presidential elections in Mexico, because there are 4 candidates running, but Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador seems to really be the front runner. He seems to be right now. So what is it about his candidacy that seems to be resonating with voters?
Polls have him at about 52% right now. So, I mean, barring anything catastrophic, he's going to be elected on Sunday. And what seems to resonate with the Mexican population is he represents something completely different than from the traditional two-party system, right? The Mexican people, the vast majority of the people, feel as though the political and the economic elite have failed them. They failed to deliver on security. They failed to improve the economy. Last year was Mexico's most violent year, and they want to change. And, you know, it sounds controversial, but there's so many similarities between AMLO and President Trump in that sense, that they want to fix the political system because the establishment clearly is not working.
Well, how would a win then for him affect relations between Mexico and the United States, especially on the issue like immigration?
On the immigration front, I think things are going to be tricky. AMLO he's much more nationalist. He's clearly very supportive of the Mexican people's, what he determines to be their right to migrate. Clearly that is, I mean, that's not where President Trump is. I hope there's a lot of areas. I hope that they can focus on the areas in which they agree. On issues like security, on economic development. I think on the immigration side of things might get tricky, but I hope that AMLO recognizes that it's both in the U.S. and Mexican government's interest to maintain stable and warm relations.
So many important issues we'll be watching in Latin America over the next several days. Anna Quintana, Senior Policy Analyst for Latin America and the Western Hemisphere at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Tonight on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly, Senator James Lankford discusses the Supreme Court's ruling this week on pro-life pregnancy centers in California and highlights the importance of free speech.
This freedom of speech is not only a freedom just to be able to say and to speak to your family and speak at your business, it's also to be able to speak different than the government. That was the foundation of our Constitution.
You can see Catherine Hadrow's interview with Senator James Lankford tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern on EWTN. Head over to EWTN.com for more times. Up next, Cardinal Timothy Dolan and fellow New Yorkers dress in World War I costumes in Times Square. We'll tell you why. And our EWTN Rome Bureau inaugurates a new radio studio ready to broadcast around the world. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. King Abdullah II of Jordan wins one of the world's most lucrative religious awards. The Templeton Prize is worth roughly $1.5 million. The king was cited for his work seeking religious harmony within Islam and between Muslims and other religions. He'll be given the award in November in Washington, D.C. Cardinal Timothy Dolan joined New York National Guard leaders yesterday in Times Square. They're honoring a Catholic priest and World War I chaplain. Father Francis Duffy was known for ministering to American soldiers in the trenches. He died in 1932 and remains the most highly decorated chaplain in U.S. Army history. The group gathered at the priest statue in Times Square on the 100th anniversary of his battlefield service. Finally tonight, it's been a busy week for Pope Francis, and the same can be said for our colleagues at the EWTN Rome offices. The team has been busy working on turning a former sauna into a studio. Last night, our staff was on hand for a blessing and celebration. The studio features a green screen, mini control room, and the ability to broadcast live. It will be used for various programming around the world on EWTN. Congratulations to our team for all of your hard work. And with that, it wraps up our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.